Some very general observations about Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Joshua, of course, is about the conquering of the land and the encouragement of Israel to follow all the laws that God gave to Moses. And they don't quite conquer the land, and it becomes a problem that they don't follow through. And it fairly carefully lists, and also in Judges, that after a couple of generations, after the children who were eyewitnesses have children, and the eyewitnesses have died, and the children of the eyewitnesses have died, that things kind of denigrate. 2 generations they denigrate. And then you get to the Judges, and at the end of Judges, you have said a couple of times, or a few times, everyone did what was right in his own eyes, with the note that there was no king in Israel. Well, there was no king like other kingdoms had kings. God was to be king, and but they moved further and further away from God's commands. So God did appoint judges to offer relief, but even after they're offered relief from the judges, there's a pattern of even God's relief turning them to look to the person who was the relief or their descendants, and it becomes a snare to them because they are seeking leadership other than God, even though God had provided leadership. So Gideon, or Zerubbabel is his nickname, his descendants, one descendant, does the usual thing to gain power, murdering his brothers, and becomes a snare. And then we get to the very nasty last several chapters about the Bethlehemite's concubine who is brutally raped. Instead of the Bethlehemite, it's a scene that reads sort of very much like Sodom and Gomorrah. That's how far denigration goes, going away from God's way of living in commands and living like the rest of the kingdoms of the earth. If you go away from God and seek your own success, you're also seeking your own degeneration. And so all Israel fights against the Gibeonites and the Bethlehemites, and or not the Gibeonites, not the Bethlehemites, but against the Benjaminites, pardon me. And Israel is divided, one tribe against another. It's a bloody conflict. God causes or allows for the casualties on both sides. And again, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And the nations that they were supposed to subdue are not subdued and become a snare to them because they're refusing to follow God. And we see this generationally over and over again. Does that apply to us? Yeah, I would say so. When you are stepping away from God's commands and following your own appetites to do what seems right in your own eyes, it leads to human denigration, yourself and those around you. And then we get to Ruth. And we have a man who is having 2 sons, and because there is famine in the promised land, he leaves to go to the country of Moab. And we remember the Moabites are descendants of Lot. We remember God's command not to be mixed in with Moab. And yet this man leaves the promised land because it's in famine. And what's the result? Well, fruitlessness for his sons. but his wife and his sons' wives survive, and Naomi decides to return to the promised land, and one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, decides to go with her. Now, there's supposed to be no mixing in, but as they return, basically Ruth has decided she's no longer Moabite. She considers herself part of Israel and makes Israel her people. And we get to Boaz. Boaz is trying to do the right thing for the stranger, in this case, a woman, Ruth, and also does the right thing with regard to the redemption of his kinsmen. And there was another redeemer who could have claimed the property, but it also have to claim Ruth, and he decides not to do it, but Boaz does. And Ruth has decided already to live as an Israelite. And from one righteous man who's trying to follow God's law with regard to mercy of the stranger and regarding his own kinsman, even though an in-law, we get what is to become the royal line. Now, when I say the royal line, we call kings of Israel, but in reality they were princes of Israel because God was still really king. So there is the benefit of a God-appointed king when the God-appointed king wants to follow God's commands. However, we'll find in 1 Samuel a problem that if they're asking for a king, that means Israel is not regarding God as king, or that God ruling is not enough for them. They want to be like the nations of the earth. So in the long term, while we see God's redemptive work through God's chosen king, it's because there was a problem in understanding that Israel wanted a king, a human king, and not just claiming God as king. Now, going back a bit further through all this story, there is a uniqueness, of course, to Israel. If we go and look archaeologically, say, to Hammurabi's code, basically Hammurabi claims that since Hammurabi is conquered, therefore Hammurabi establishes the gods of his kingdom. This is wildly foreign to us and wildly foreign to Israel. And if you look back further, all the way in the Exodus out of Egypt, and all the nations that fear Israel coming out of Egypt is because, Israel has a living God, not just established by somebody's proclamation for a time, so that Israel's success was a fearful thing to all the earth. If you claim that you know right from wrong because God has revealed it, there's going to be many people on earth that are going to fear you, and there's going to be many people on earth that are going to try and denigrate you because, that sounds terribly arrogant to them because you're claiming something beyond yourself, and who do they have? So when we get further on to the reading of the prophets like Isaiah, how is it that anybody would form an image themselves and then bow down to it? Well, that's really what human behavior is like when they're not following the God of heaven and earth. And you end up getting people living out like the lack of ethics we find in the book of the Judges. Yet God is still working to bring about relief and redemption. It's a nice long story. I hope this helps as we move forward through reading the Bible through the year. Of course, we don't get the Gospels until sometime around in September, but with what we're familiar with, keep looking back to see how things are being further fulfilled. And finally, when we get to autumn, how God is fulfilling all things in God's very self for the redemption of us and all the earth. I hope this is of some help to us. Thank you, and God bless.